It's no secret that the Catholic Church is the largest charitable organization in the world, serving people all around the globe and advocating for peace and justice. If you've ever been a part of any of this work, you have no doubt been introduced to the 7 tenets of Catholic social teaching, the guiding principles to everything we do in society. What might actually be a secret, though, is where these 7 tenets come from. While each of these principles find their ultimate foundation in Scripture and have been promoted implicitly by the Church for centuries, the explicit development of a so-called social doctrine finds its origin in the 1891 encyclical Rerum Novarum. Since then, the Vatican has produced 16 social encyclicals, 1 pastoral constitution, 1 decree, and innumerable addresses and homilies aimed at developing the Church's involvement in the world. What are these documents and what do they address? This is Catholicism in Focus. There's no question that the work of charity has existed in the Church for centuries. Being Christian means more than just knowing what Jesus said, it means living as he did, which means feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, housing the homeless, visiting the imprisoned, and caring for the sick. But as we began to learn over the years, it's not simply enough to treat the poor, we must also address the conditions that lead people to become poor. This is the work of justice. In the 19th century, the Church witnessed what was arguably the greatest shift in society, politics, and economics the world had ever seen: the Industrial Revolution. As enormous amounts of wealth were produced with little regulation in place, workers began to be oppressed, families were strained, and the common good of society was challenged. The Church needed to respond. Thus, in 1891, Pope Leo XIII promulgated the first social encyclical, Rerum Novarum, literally of revolutionary change. At the heart of the document is the relationship between capital and labor, in many ways the central question of the economy. What rights do laborers have? What responsibilities do owners have to the common good? Society must be justly ordered for all. Pope Leo used the document to list the many errors of unrestricted capitalism that give rise to social ills, and to criticize socialism as an adequate remedy. For a society to be just, the right to private ownership must be maintained, but oriented towards the common good, meaning that laborers are to be paid a just wage to support their families, and may strike or form labor unions to ensure this. 40 years later, in 1931, the main problem facing society was not the private sector of unrestricted capitalism, but the public sector of post-war totalitarian governments. Thus, in Quadragesimo Anno, literally 40 years later, Pope Pius XI warns about the failure to respect freedom to form associations and stresses the principle of solidarity and cooperation. It's in this document that the Church sees for the first time the explicit reference to subsidiarity, the principle that the lowest competent social order need not hand over its authority to a higher order, and an explicit rejection of liberalism, understood as unlimited competition between economic forces. Pius also wrote 2 other letters specific to developing authoritarian regimes of the 1930s. Non abbiamo bisogno, written in Italian as a rebuke against the fascist regime of Italy, and Mit brennen der Sorge, written in German against the Third Reich in Germany. The latter of these letters has quite the drama to it. Knowing of the strict surveillance of the German government, it would have been nearly impossible to circulate the letter by ordinary means. Instead, the letter was snuck into the country and read aloud from the pulpit at every single church on Palm Sunday, essentially all at one time to every Catholic in Germany, preventing the government from intervening. Hitler was not particularly pleased by this, which, if you read the letter, you can understand why. Pius condemned the Nazi myth of race and blood, the idolizing of state power or religion, defended the Old Testament, and encouraged priests to speak out against the untruths of society. Looking to the other side of Europe, Pius XI also wrote Divini Redemptoris, a systematic criticism of communism, inspired in large part by the rise of the Soviet Union. Pius described the economic philosophy as intrinsically perverse, contrasting it with Christian civilization, which is marked by the practice of evangelical charity, the fulfillment of the duties of justice at both the interpersonal and social levels in relation to the common good, and the institutionalization of professional and interprofessional groups. Unfortunately, his words were not enough to stem the tide of these totalitarian regimes, and society was ripped apart by the Second World War. This made it nearly impossible for Pope Pius XII to write any letters of his own, but he did communicate with the world through the radio, promoting natural law as the soul of the system to be established on both the national and the international levels. By the early 1960s, the devastation of World War II was beginning to subside, and society started to look with hope to a more peaceful, just world. Reading the signs of the times, Pope John XXIII wrote 2 papal encyclicals during his pontificate. In Mater et Magistra, literally mother and teacher, Pope John reminded the world that the Church filled the role of mother and teacher, emphasizing the need for community and socialization where greed and violence reign. Whereas previous letters had focused on the plight of workers in cities, here John calls attention to the limited growth experienced by people in rural areas, particularly in the area of agriculture. The truth of the gospel is obviously important, but it's kind of irrelevant if there are no roads to get where people are or clean drinking water to keep them alive. The same argument could be made for Pacem in Terris, peace on earth. If nuclear proliferation continues on its trajectory since World War II, there will soon be no church left to build, as we run the risk of annihilating everything in sight. Recognizing the global nature of this new catastrophic threat, Pacem in Terris is the first encyclical to be addressed to all men of goodwill, a call not only to Christians, but to everyone who wants peace, to establish with truth, justice, love, and freedom new methods of relationships in human society. John calls on the public authorities to tackle and solve problems of an economic, social, political, or cultural character which are posed by the universal common good. Just as the extreme of totalitarian governments must be condemned, so too should the extreme of laissez-faire governments that do not exercise their rightful duty to ensure peace and the common good. This should not be left simply to each individual nation, but to the world at large. This sentiment was made even more authoritative in the social doctrine of the Church in 1965 with the first and only pastoral constitution on the Church in the modern world, Gaudium et Spes, Joy and Hope. The work of the Second Vatican Council, Gaudium et Spes, systematically brings together the previously promulgated teachings of the popes, the nobility of marriage and the family, the proper development of culture, economic and social life, political responsibilities, and the need to foster peace among nations, doing so in the light of a Christian anthropological outlook and of the Church's mission. At the root of all that the Church does must be the dignity of the human person, for as the Council teaches, humanity is the only creature that God willed for its own sake. Although a bit lofty and idealistic at times, the document serves as the foundation of the Church's mission in the world, calling all of humanity to build a just society. It's from this foundation of the dignity of the human person that the Council produced a somewhat supplemental document, Dignitatis Humanae, literally the dignity of humanity, stressing the importance of one's conscience and explicitly proclaiming the right to religious freedom. Inspired by the Council, in 1976, Pope Paul VI promulgated Popularum Progressio, the progress of peoples, stressing the importance of integral development of the human person. While previous popes taught that the economy must serve the needs of humanity and not the other way around, Paul VI went a step further, including the need for the acquisition of culture, respect of the dignity of others, and the acknowledgement of the highest good, the recognition of God himself, the author and end of these blessings. In other words, if you want someone to be more humane, they need to have more than just money. They need all that is fitting to goodness, peace, justice, education, health, solidarity, and faith. In 1971, 80 years after Rerum Novarum, Paul VI promulgated Octogesima Adveniens, reflecting on the original need for Rerum Novarum in its time and offering updates for a post-industrial society. Notable topics addressed include urbanization, the condition of young people, the condition of women, unemployment, discrimination, emigration, population growth, the influence of the means of social communications, and the ecological problem. Continuing this trend, John Paul II's first 3 encyclicals were also reflections on previous documents. Laborum Exercens, through work, echoes Rerum Novarum's insistence on the fundamental rights of laborers, but expands on it by offering a deeper foundation. Work is to be protected because it brings fulfillment to the human person, developing a person's natural and supernatural vocation to fulfillment. Solicitudo Rei Socialis, social concern, was written on the 20th anniversary of Popularum Progressio, echoing Paul VI's teachings on development, updating them in the wake of the failed development of the Third World. John Paul II outlines the differences between progress and development, namely that our work must focus not just on the manipulation of goods and services, but on the being of humanity. In 1991, 100 years after Rerum Novarum, he wrote again, reflecting on the continuity of the Church's teaching over a century of work. Called Centesimus Annus for obvious reasons, John Paul II focuses on the need for solidarity in our world today, a principle he claims was implicit in Leo's own writing under the title Friendship. 4 years later, in 1994, John Paul II ventured away from economic issues to devote an entire document on one principle: the sanctity of human life. Evangelium Vitae, the Gospel of Life, takes the teaching of the inherent dignity of the human person found in so many letters and expounds it, offering a biblical foundation for its sanctity and a condemnation of the culture of death. The document decries the evil of abortion and euthanasia and lays the foundation for Pope Francis's ultimate removal of the death penalty from the Church teaching. By 2009, the growth in information technology and global economics had transformed the world yet again, requiring yet another update to the Church's call for integral human development. In Benedict XVI's Caritas in Veritate, Charity in Truth, the Church got just that. At the heart of the document, and captured in its name, is the sense that charity must always be grounded in truth, that without the ultimate foundation of the gospel, love can become an empty shell based on emotion, possibly even undermining the work of love. It is an incredibly comprehensive document calling for Christians to address the wide-reaching issues of the world, including global poverty, the arms race, the environment, migration, sexual exploitation, bioethics, cultural relativism, social solidarity, energy, and above all, the authentic human development of all peoples. If you're looking for an introduction to the primary texts of Catholic social teaching, this is where you want to start. Fantastic document. And finally, as of 2020, Pope Francis has written 2 social encyclicals, Laudato Si, an encyclical on the environment, and Querida Amazonia, a document on the response to the issues facing the Amazon. Both are incredible documents about which I have made separate videos, and so I'm not going to say anything more about them here. What I will say, though, is that these 2 documents build upon everything that came before them. While some want to look at Pope Francis and call him a Marxist, a liberal, someone who doesn't understand church teaching or tradition, these things couldn't be further from the truth. What he says about the fair distribution of wealth, care for creation, rights of laborers, need for government intervention for the common good, and the death penalty do not come from nowhere. They find their foundation in the more than a century's worth of the Church's social teaching on life in the modern world. If you find something that he says troubling, it might be just the opportunity you need to get more acquainted with the tradition that informs him.